Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
Welcome to the Pint Glass Football Podcast.
We are excited to be joined by Alicia de Artola, the editor at FanSided and the co-host of Reign of Troy Radio, the popular USC football podcast. She's covered USC and college football for over a decade, brings expert insights on all things Trojans, of course. Alicia, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to talk USC with you guys.
Yeah, always excited to talk about a big-time program like USC and a big-time program that's in the news and really seems to be a big story right now. So let's jump right into this. The USC Notre Dame rivalry. There's been some buzz this week. Of course, Pat Forty was reporting that the series could be in jeopardy. One of the most historic rivalries in all of college football. Let's start with, do you think there's real concern that this rivalry could end? And then on top of that, what are your sources telling you about where things stand right now between USC and Notre Dame? Sounds like there's some ongoing negotiations right now.
Yeah, I'm an eternal optimist. The fact that there are negotiations and part of me wants to treat this the way that you would treat like a cable subscription having a disagreement with the providers, like, oh, you lose ESPN for an hour, but eventually they come around and they come to an agreement. That's sort of my optimistic hope of where this is all going to end. But the fact is that USC and Notre Dame don't have an agreement on what the future of the series is, and it seems like they have they are on two sides of a way to go forward. Notre Dame's way would be what it's been, which is to say you sign a 10-year contract, you're locked in, you're good to go. And USC, it sounds like USC wants some flexibility with the changing landscape of college football. They have offered to do, a 1-year deal for next year, and then let's talk again. Maybe, I've heard sort of chatter about maybe USC wants to do it like 3 years at a time or 4 years at a time or whatever it is. So it just seems like they are disagreeing on details. I think theoretically everybody wants the rivalry to stand, but they want it to stand a certain way. Like USC wants life to be a bit easier for them by potentially moving it to a season opener. Notre Dame doesn't want to do that because Notre Dame's scheduling complexities may mean that Notre Dame has difficulty filling their later season slots, and having USC be a always fill an October or November date has been very convenient for them. For USC, always playing Notre Dame in November or October has always been slightly inconvenient because it changes the way that USC's conference schedule is. So there are some legitimate gripes from USC's perspective in terms of the ways that this rivalry has inconvenienced USC to a point, certainly with the logistics of travel and all of that kind of stuff. So it would seem to me like USC is trying to get Notre Dame to budge and sort of concede a few things, like moving the game earlier in the season, maybe moving the game to neutral sites every once in a while, and sort of like going along with what USC logistically would benefit the most from. And Notre Dame, it sounds like, is very interested in continuing the rivalry as it was and as it has always been. And I think that Notre Dame fans would tell you that they already conceded by giving USC the October date in the first place. They used to always play in November. USC got tired of going to South Bend, Indiana in November and in the middle of winter or in the cold. So Notre Dame budged on that one. And I think that it's just a question of like who's going to give in. And I don't know who's going to give in, to be honest. And I think there is a possibility that both sides don't give in. We've already heard Lincoln Riley utter the words, some rivalries have had to end. And as a fan of this particular rivalry, those words sent shivers down my spine. I'm not happy to hear the head coach at USC even open the door to the possibility of this rivalry ending. Given the Lincoln Riley of it all, given the changing landscape of college football, given the fact that USC has already given up traditional rivalries, that USC made life difficult for everybody else in the Pac-10 because they insisted on keeping Stanford and Cal as traditional rivals, and they gave up those rivalries to go to the Big Ten. So this might just be a different USC administration. But one of the criticisms of USC for a long time was the idea that USC was like incestuous. They would only ever hire USC people. You had to know USC. You had to be of USC. And that caused so many problems for USC. It just brain drain and just, people not thinking outside the box, stuck in their own ways. So USC made a major change by, for the first time, hiring an athletic director who was not of USC when they brought in Mike Bone. Followed through on that again with Jen Cohen, again, someone not of USC. In that sense, they bring in Lincoln Riley, who, has no connections to USC either, just an admiration from afar. So the bulk of the decision makers at USC, and then they bring in Notre Dame's GM, Bowen, to run that side. So USC is being run by people who are not USC people. And so any of my expectations for how they will treat this rivalry that is so near and dear to USC fans, or at least some of us, it's a little bit off kilter. I'm not actually that certain about whether or not whether or not my optimism that we'll get to a 11th hour deal is a reality, because, it's possible they aren't motivated by the same things that USC might have been motivated in the past.
What's the financial ramifications of this?
USC would say that the financial ramifications would not be significant because USC moved to the Big Ten to cash in on Big Ten money, and they will be cashing in on Big Ten money. And that almost makes the Notre Dame question slightly irrelevant. Obviously, I think that USC would take a financial hit in terms of the brand of being guaranteed to have that marquee place in college football in terms of rivalry games every single year. I think that even when USC has not been good, there is always one game that you guarantee will be on national television with a national audience that people will just tune into because it's USC Notre Dame. And USC will lose a bit of that cachet theoretically, but financially, this is mostly from USC's perspective about whatever it takes to put USC in position to cash in where the cash cow lies, which is the college football playoff. I will say straight out that I find this approach to be cowardly and counterproductive. But the idea being that any season that USC has Notre Dame on their schedule is a season that USC has made their out-of-conference schedule harder in a way that a lot of other programs either have chosen not to or don't often do. Because anytime USC wants to do a home and home with another program, that's a second out of conference big name rivalry game. So, or big name marquee game that they can cash in on. So there's this push and pull between the difficulty of the schedule, which has only gotten more difficult with going to the Big Ten, and the out of conference scheduling, which also means that every other year USC is giving up a home date. There are areas where USC would say, if we make life easier on the team, i.e. give them an extra home date, give them an extra date that's more likely to be a win because it's probably against UC Davis or whatever, and rack up wins that gets them into the college football playoff, then they'll cash in on the college football playoff, and then that money will generate more revenue for the football team to do the revenue sharing and all this kind of stuff that's going to be coming to college football. Again, like I said, I find that to be a counterproductive way to think of things, because in my perspective, a USC team that loses to Notre Dame and is thus disqualified from the playoff was not a playoff team to begin with. So I think USC is putting the cart before the horse a little bit here. Like, maybe focus on being good enough to get into the playoff first, because I don't want to be in the playoff unless USC has a chance to win the playoff, personally. But I think from a in the weeds USC perspective, like, I understand that this is college football now. I understand that they were driven by every little margin that can get them closer to be in that 12 or 16 field. And unfortunately, it seems like USC has focus in on this particular game as a potential barrier to being in that field. And it doesn't sound like USC is willing to continue that game unless Notre Dame makes it slightly easier for USC to justify having the game on the schedule from that, dollars and cents college football playoff calculation, as it were.
I hate the idea of this rivalry possibly going away. I think all college football fans hate the idea of this possibly going away. But I do understand it from USC's perspective in the Big Ten, whereas in the Pac-12, they pretty much were able to stay on the West Coast. A trip to Indiana to play Notre Dame might have been their only trip to that degree on the whole season. Now they're traveling all over the nation to play in the Big Ten. And let's face it, it's not the Pac-12 anymore. They've got an uphill climb in this conference. In the Pac-12, a big win over Notre Dame could be enough to maybe push them into the national title conversation because they only had so many marquee games on the schedule. Now with Ohio State and Oregon and Penn State, Ohio State and so forth, maybe they're looking at this and saying, look, we don't need another hurdle to get through. We already have a gauntlet of teams we have to get through now to make that push. But I'm with you from the historical part of it, just the fact that this is one of the best rivalries in football. I'd hate to see it go. And I think reading between the lines here, Notre Dame signing this deal with Clemson, I think is making it look even more and more likely that they're already kind of planning for a future rivalry to replace this one, which is certainly, I hope, not the case. Let's jump into this season. I want to start with the quarterback room. Alicia, in your recent article for FanSided, you talked about Jayden Maiava. You talked about the experience as quote unquote chaotic, and rightfully so, given the turnovers, the inconsistency, yet he still went 3-1 as a starter, including that clutch fourth quarter win in the bowl win over Texas A&M. What did you take away from his brief run at quarterback, and what do you think it tells us about the state of USC's quarterback room heading into this next season?
I think that Jayden Maiava being the quarterback for USC is probably a sign of how limited the transfer portal quarterback situation has been over the last 2 years compared to 3 years ago. I think that if USC had had an opportunity to bring in a higher caliber quarterback, or at least certainly a more reliable, steady quarterback, less of a roller coaster type quarterback, I think USC would have. That doesn't mean that I don't think that USC has a bit of confidence in Jayden Maiava. I don't think Lincoln Riley recruits him to come to USC in the moment that they did, unless he saw something in him. It's not lost on me that he was going to go to Georgia and that Georgia was looking at him, which is another sign that, programs at the top of the sport were looking at him as a player with that level of potential. But the 4 games that he played for USC were, as you said, they were chaotic. They were certainly interesting. They were very up and down, very, possibly the most up and down of any USC quarterback I can remember. I thought that Sam Darnold was an up and down experience because he was just a little bit backyard football-y, and Maiava, ramped it up to 100 in terms of not being able to know from one play to the next what was going to happen. The bowl game is such a good example of the Jayden Maiava experience, and is also a really good example of why I think that USC fans are very split on coming into this season with the quarterback room that they're coming into. If you're a USC fan and you want to, fight for Jayden Maiava and say that he's the guy, you just point to the end of that Texas A&M game. He was out there slinging it, making plays. He had that winning mentality, and he was able to go out and get the win that he needed. But I'm not going to lie, the first three were some of the worst quarterback play I've ever seen a USC quarterback have. I was literally sitting in, my podcast co-host is my husband. So we're in our apartment and we're watching this game and we're looking at each other in the third quarter and asking, what was the worst performance by a USC quarterback that we have ever seen? And was it better than what we've seen in this game? And I think we decided at a certain point that this was the worst quarterback performance we had ever seen from a USC quarterback, which says a lot. And then we're prepared to come on the podcast and just be like, oh my gosh, that was rough. And then we end up on the podcast just cackling at how absurd it is that USC ended up winning that game and that Jayden Maiava was a huge reason that they went on to win that game. So again, I don't know that USC can know for certain what they're going to get from him. My pessimistic side says that, USC bet a lot on what Miller Moss did in the bowl game the previous year, and clearly Miller Moss didn't work out at USC. The optimist in me points specifically to Miller Moss as a reason why maybe Maiava is that guy, because we spent the entire season looking at Miller Moss and saying he wasn't playing bad. He was playing fine, certainly within the context of having an offensive line that didn't look like it could, block for anything. I thought he did admirably well for most of that season. And the quarterback change, to me, I supported the quarterback change just because it just felt like USC needed something different. Because despite Miller Moss generally doing a good job, he played his worst football in the fourth quarter, and he seemed to, outside of that LSU game, seemed to not be able to make the plays when USC needed him to make the plays. And that is the total opposite of Jayden Maiava. Like, they are, if you put Miller Moss and Jayden Maiava together, you'd have an amazing quarterback. But in the end, what matters in football? Is it how you start or is it how you finish? And Jayden Maiava, compared to Miller Moss, finished so much better that USC ended up with a 3-1 record in the time that he started, versus the USC that was led by Miller Moss that maybe played better for 3 quarters, but then couldn't finish. So there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't think it's fair to totally rule out Maiava as a perfectly capable quarterback that could win a lot of games with USC. But I think you'd be kidding yourself if you didn't at least acknowledge that Jayden Maiava is perfectly capable of losing a lot of games for USC, theoretically. He did very well to keep USC in the game against Notre Dame, but the fact is, driving with a chance to tie the game, he threw a pick six, and that was the backbreaker. There's a lot of mixed feelings there, and I think that's part of the reason why the freshman that comes in, Hassan Longstreet, a lot of USC fans are pinning some hopes on him being able to come in and win over that job, whether it's coming out of fall camp or at some point in the season. But I do think it says a lot that USC fans are pinning their hopes on a true freshman quarterback that, even as a recruit, was being talked about as somebody who's maybe not one of those guys who's ready to step right in and start right away. And if USC is looking at him to be that guy, then something has gone wrong, is my perspective there.
I want to talk about the transfer portal. And we know how important the transfer portal has become in this modern age of college football. USC had a really busy offseason in the transfer portal, 26 players left. The Trojans end up with the number 16 transfer class in the Big Ten, while you look at West Coast rival Oregon landed the number 1 class. How concerned should USC fans be about that level of roster turnover and how Lincoln O'Reilly has approached the portal compared to the other teams and the other rivals in the Big Ten?
Yeah, I think the portal has been something that Riley, I think he freely admits that he's gotten wrong at USC, recognizing that first season that he came in, he got the portal right. I think that USC hit on more guys than they missed on in that first portal run when they totally flipped the roster and made it capable of almost getting to the play. We're basically a Caleb Williams hamstring injury away from going to the playoff. The next year, I think that early success from the portal backfired badly because a lot of the guys that they brought in that season didn't quite gel in the same way. More things went wrong with that transfer class. And then this past season, I think, again, USC has seen that relying on the transfers, which USC has been doing, hasn't always been fruitful. USC's hit on every running back they've brought in, so that's a plus, but the offensive linemen have been hit and miss. The linebackers have been hit and miss. The DBs have been hit and miss. The defensive linemen certainly have been, I won't say they're hit and miss. I think the defensive linemen that USC brought in were very admirable, capable players, but they were from Purdue and Wyoming, and they were undersized and just were not ever going to be able to alone be guys that stood up to what USC was going to face in the Big Ten. So this past season, they've stated this outright that USC has shifted the approach, which is to say relying a little bit less on trying to identify like starting level talent in the transfer portal, or at least maybe not identify, maybe shelling out the money, because I think USC was putting a lot of their NIL like percentages in transfer portal guys. And this past season, it feels like they haven't been as aggressive, with the exception of the defensive linemen that they brought in. And I understand totally why that was the case. Jamal Jarrett from Georgia and Keyshawn Silver from Kentucky. USC was just so desperate for 300 plus pound human beings that it sort of made a lot of sense for them to put a lot of eggs in those baskets. But aside from that, the additions that they've added have been a little bit more focused around depth, and then very, very clearly to me focused around not this year, but next year, in the sense that they've brought in Tamir Robinson from Penn State, the linebacker. He's not a transfer for this year. He's a transfer to see what he does in the future. He's coming in as a sophomore. Zacharias Williams, the wide receiver from Utah. Theoretically, USC can look at him and say he's not for this year, he's for next year. I think he's for this year personally, but I also have really, really high hopes for him. But Kennedy Urlacher from Notre Dame, again, another guy who's sort of a sophomore that you don't need. He's not the finished product at this point. So with the exception of like the defensive lineman and then the like cornerback from San Jose State, DJ Harvey, who's literally a relative of USC's starting best safety, Kamari Ramsey, and the safety from NC State, Bishop Fitzgerald, who is a plug and play guy. Outside of those guys, it just feels like USC has targeted development projects and, a little bit more of like cheaper coin tosses. And I don't want to say that means that USC is punting on this coming season, because I don't think that's the case. But I think that USC has decided that instead of spending their assets in the transfer portal, they're going to put all of those dollars into recruiting, into high school recruiting, and sort of live with the consequences of that, I think, for this year. I think there's more of a long-term outlook from USC in that perspective. So like comparing USC's class to Oregon's, I'm not surprised that Oregon was the number one class there, because Oregon is very aggressive in the portal and has been. And that's where, they took USC's best offensive lineman from the portal. And that was a major blow to USC. But the fact is that Oregon was able to take that lineman because USC was not willing to pay him the dollar, like not willing to match. And there were a lot of guys that left that USC was simply not willing to match, whether they're good players or not, whether they would have wanted to stay at USC or not. I think there's a couple guys who were just destined to leave, but I think there were other guys that I don't know that they would have left if USC had invested in them, and not necessarily like overinvest in them, but like give them closer to the dollar figures that they were looking at. And USC kind of passed on a lot of those guys because I think USC's transfer philosophy has changed in terms of where they're investing. The payoff on that, the proof on that will be in the pudding. And this is where it gets really interesting. I don't know that the change in philosophy is going to be heavily reflected in this season, more so pointed towards 2026, which is interesting because that would imply that USC is looking ahead to 2026 with the current regime.
Let's look ahead here, because I want to look at this 2026 class, of course, but I want to start with the incoming class. USC pulled off a pretty furious finish to the 2025 recruiting cycle, end up landing the top 15 class according to 24/7 Sports. What stood out to you about this group, and which freshmen should Trojan fans really be keeping an eye on this fall, or are there any? I know you were kind of talking about, future building here, but it seems like more and more in the modern age of college football, there's more and more impact freshmen we see around the country. So does USC have some guys that we can look at and say, hey, these guys could be impact players day one?
Yeah, I think USC fully intends for Jakeem Stewart, the defensive lineman out of New Orleans, to be that guy. I think maybe he won't be a day one starter, but I guarantee you he is not taking a red shirt. I guarantee you he will be involved from day one. They think very highly of him. He's 6'6", 270. He's explosive. He's powerful. His high school sort of he had his high school senior season sort of disrupted for reasons. So where he's at in terms of development from a technical side is a bigger question. But in terms of talent, I think that USC believes he can come in and be an impact freshman. The question is not how much he plays. It's about whether or not like he's able to win a starting job. Ideally, I think USC would tell you now, like he's capable of being freshman All-American level. he's definitely somebody that they're looking at as an immediate impact player. This class includes a lot of beef. USC went all out with defensive linemen, offensive linemen, with size, with lots of size. So I think a bulk of this class, you're right, like is probably looking to the future. I don't necessarily want the 4-star offensive tackle Alex Payne to be starting right away for USC or to be heavily involved in this season, because frankly, if Alex Payne is playing, then I mean, maybe it's because he's that good, which I would love. But more likely for me, if a freshman offensive lineman is playing, then you're pretty desperate on the offensive line. And I don't want USC to be in that position. The defensive guys, Tristan Castro, Alex Graham, Steve Miller, I don't see how they have immediate impact, not because they're not good players. They're good players, but USC has the obvious starters and backups and competition at corner and safety. I just don't see how they break through. Same with the running backs, Lee Wormley and Harry Dalton. USC brought in 2 transfers that I think, one is Wayman Jordan from the JUCO ranks, who's technically part of the high school class. He was the best player in JUCO last year, and they also brought in another number 1 running back that they can rely on. Like, I don't see any of these running backs getting in and seeing playing time. The position where I think that USC is most likely to potentially end up seeing some of these freshmen break through is wide receiver. Maybe Corey Sims has a good fall and breaks through. Maybe Romero Eisen breaks through. I know a lot of people in the USC side really like Tanook Hines, the receiver out of Houston, who's a 4-star, but like, just, I think people love the way he plays with some just physicality and speed and just a good mix of attributes. So I wouldn't put it past any of those guys to potentially break through, because frankly, USC's wide receiving core is built more on potential than actual production. And so I can see a scenario where those guys see early playing time. I think if USC had their way right now, USC would be able to look at this class and say, projecting out 2-3 years, if USC is competing in the college football playoff, it's because this class has developed and gotten them there.
You mentioned the trenches and kind of adding some beef. USC recently hiring Kerry Thompson brings in experience from both the HBCU and different Division I programs as an assistant strength coach. How important are these for Lincoln Riley's vision of that future? What impact could they have on the Trojans' performance and culture? Because I think you really hit on something here with the trenches and the beef, because, kind of bringing up once again, the obvious West Coast rival, the old rival with Oregon, it felt like they were a little more prepared for Big Ten play just based on how they had been recruiting in the last few years leading into this shift to the Big Ten, investing heavily in the trenches and really bringing a lot of size and strength up front. I don't know if USC was necessarily built for this change to the Big Ten right now. And so is this move, this addition, is this part of that shift for them?
I would take this as just more signs of how much USC is investing in those spots in a way that they hadn't been before. And I think that you can look at specifically in recruiting the trenches, why is it that Oregon has been the dominant force in the Pac-12 and then now, first year in the Big Ten over the last, 10 years when USC has basically abdicated their throne? And you have to look at, it starts at what Oregon has done recruiting their defensive line and their offensive line, particularly their offensive line, and particularly in the sense that there are many players that have come through Oregon, starting with Penei Sewell, that should have been Trojans, that would have been in previous times, would have been USC guys, like USC letting some of these big time defensive and offensive linemen go to Oregon was a major sign of ways that USC was failing beyond just Oregon's NIL power, which is obviously a thing, but USC not being willing to stand up to that NIL power really set USC back. And what we've seen from USC, certainly over the past 2 years and extremely over the past year, is a renewed investment in every single aspect that makes a football program tick. And part of the reason that USC didn't win those recruiting battles 5 years ago is because the Clay Helton era USC had not invested in all of this, all of the the max that they could invest in strength and conditioning, the max that they could invest in recruiting personnel, the max that they could have invested in all of the other elements that give any program an edge. And now we're seeing USC take those swings and make those hires. And just you think about what USC did earlier this year with hiring Chad Bowden, and then also hiring like 3 or 4 other guys that would have been candidates to be USC's GM to positions that were under USC's GM. And you don't do that unless you're offering to those coaches. And you don't bring in someone like Kerry Thompson unless you give him a very good reason to come to USC. It's just the sign that USC is taking itself a little bit more seriously. Trumaine Carroll, the strength and conditioning head that USC just brought in from Kansas State, all indications are that he absolutely loved Kansas State, that he was not necessarily looking to leave. And then USC kind of came in and gave him an offer that was beyond what he could have dreamed of at Kansas State. That the USC of 5 years ago does not do that. The USC of 5 years ago is scraping around looking for diamonds in the rough in terms of size, in terms of inherent talent, in terms of maximizing talent, in terms of all of those things. This is not a USC that's looking for diamonds in the rough anymore. And that's big.
Lincoln Riley and USC currently hold the number 1 recruiting class in the nation. I know that's got people's eyes open for the 2026 class. And with the addition of GM Chad Bowden and really an elite front office staff, it feels to me like the Trojans, like you just mentioned, are kind of getting back to their old recruiting dominance. How has this new structure really changed the game for USC on the recruiting trail? You know, you kind of alluded to it, but the combination of these things, how is it leading to so much success to be holding that number 1 spot right now?
This is a complete change from what we've seen from USC. I mean, I have been following USC recruiting for the better part of 20 years, and I have never seen USC have this many recruits, this many commits at this stage in the recruiting process. And I think realistically in the past, if this had been the case in the past, I would have looked at it and said, oh, well, you know, you can't count your chickens before they hatch, because you can have all the commits you want, but if they don't sign with you come December or February, then there was no point in that. I think the big difference that Chad Bowden has brought in is and obviously I say this in May, and we may look back at this come December and we can clip me saying this and point to, you know, give it over to Old Takes Exposed or whatever. But the way that USC is going about recruiting with Chad Bowden is so philosophically different that I am actually somewhat confident that the majority of these players will end up signing for USC. And this is the reason. And it's actually funny because USC has been in the news lately for the biggest decommit that they've had, which is Xavier Griffin, the linebacker out of Georgia, 5-star linebacker. I was super excited about this kid. USC now has a really bad track record of getting early commits from Georgia kids and then losing them. But the reason that USC loses him is not the same as the reason that USC lost the defensive lineman that they had committed last year. Xavier Griffin committed to USC last year before Chad Bowden had come in as USC's GM. Chad Bowden arrives at USC and makes a policy, which is to say that if you commit to USC, you are locked in. You are a locked-in commit to USC. You are not taking additional visits. You are 100% with us. And so all of the commitments that USC has brought in over the past few months since Bowden came in have come in knowing that that was the policy. And you've seen one by one, the majority of them shut down their recruitment. You know, I believe, you know, Tom Tupoi from Mater Dei has shut down his commitment. Kenai Pepe from IMG, I believe, has shut down his commitment. Like, the majority of these players have committed and then said, I'm not taking more visits. And I think that part of that is USC building in a system where they're obviously giving some NIL incentive there. I would be shocked if that wasn't the case, and sort of using that to their advantage, but being very forthright and upright with what the expectations for players are if they are going to commit to USC. And the problem for Xavier Griffin was that he committed to USC not with that understanding, and he wanted to take visits, and USC had a hardline stance with him. And we can debate the merits of having such a hardline stance that you lose a top 10 player in the class, which again, I have mixed feelings about. But I kind of respect the hardline stance in terms of Bowden clearly has made a policy and is not going to budge on that policy. And the message that sends to the rest of that class, that these, 27, I think, commits, is that Bowden's going to follow through. And if you want to come to USC and you've committed to USC and you're locked in, you're happy with the NIL deal that they've offered you, you're happy with the coaches, you're happy with the recruiting element, then if you're happy with that in March, you're going to be happy with that in December. The other thing that we've heard from commits across the board is that unlike potentially previous regimes or previous staffs where you'd get a commitment and then hear a little bit less from the coaching staff and from the recruiting staff, these kids are saying, I'm being recruited just as hard now as I was before I committed. They're really keeping tabs on trying to keep all of these guys happy and set to go forward. Will that follow through? It's a long time to December. There's a whole lot that can change. So we will see how effective this approach truly is. We pin a lot of this on Chad Bowden, but I don't think we can underestimate how important it has been that USC has brought in the tight ends coach who Chad Savage, who was a mega Southern California recruiter for Colorado State, who gets raved about by every recruit that ever talks to him, who brings that kind of energy. USC brought in, Rob Ryan to be the linebackers coach, and everyone assumed that he'd just be a coach, on-field coach, and not do any recruiting. And instead, he's out here, flying to Hawaii and flying to this and this and this, and in kids' living rooms doing all the hard recruiting work that no one expected of him. I think that the culture within USC's recruiting staff, within the coaching staff, is right now very recruiting focused in a way that I think that Lincoln Riley's initial staff was deficient in, which is probably why they had more success with the transfer portal guys than the high school guys, because the transfer portal guys are only in that window for 2 weeks and then they're signed and then you don't have to worry about it. So it just feels like a big philosophical shift that gives me some more confidence that the names that you see in this current recruiting class are likely to be the same names that sign. Obviously, USC will almost certainly lose a few of these guys because that's the way recruiting goes. But it also feels like USC has contingency plans and is very organized and very thoughtful and very deliberate about the way that they're approaching recruiting in a way that they have completely and utterly dropped the ball basically since Steve Sarkisian.
Yeah, and let's face it, when you have this loaded of a class, they quite frankly could afford to lose a few and still have a really, really good recruiting class. Mm-hmm. So definitely a lot of excitement for the future there. But with that being said, the pressure on Lincoln Riley, I think looking at last season with the 7-6 record being the worst of Lincoln Riley's head coaching career, I saw just recently CBS Sports Brad Crawford projected USC to finish 8-4, 7th in the Big Ten. How much pressure is Lincoln Riley under to deliver results this year? I know we kind of talked about the future and looking ahead a little bit and what they're building, but if the Trojans do end up with another disappointing season somewhere around that mark, what do you think that means for his future here at USC?
I think there's a real push and pull, and I think this is the most fascinating part of the next year. Obviously, I don't want USC to be in the same position that they were in this coming year, but I think it's interesting to think about the Nebraska of it all. Nebraska had those years where they lost a bunch of games close, and everyone thought, well, you lose the games close and then you eventually turn it over and you start winning, right? And for Nebraska, it never did. And Scott Frost, it only turned downward. And the reality sort of set in that a change had to be made. For USC, I think that I have been more forgiving of what USC came away with this past season because so many of those games were so close. And because USC did look capable of beating Penn State. And USC did look capable of beating Michigan at the Big House, if not for one or two little plays that were just one linebacker lost, didn't fit their gap. And then suddenly, two of the best running backs in the country are off to the races. Same with the Notre Dame game. And I won't forgive the Maryland loss because that was a truly horrendous loss. But USC was not far from winning a lot of these games. And so I was willing to give Lincoln Riley a little bit more grace of they're not so far away. If you get one more push, one player to improve going forward to the next year, then maybe that's the difference between winning 9-10 games. The problem for USC is that if you do go into this coming season and you don't win 9-10 games, then you are in that Nebraska situation where where regardless of how you're losing games, you are still losing games. USC should just never be content with losing 6 games. USC should not be content with losing 5 games or even 4 games, regardless of how difficult the schedule is. That's not the standard that USC sets. That's certainly not the standard that USC set when they hired a head coach for $10 million a year, $10 million plus a year. So the pressure will be heavy on Lincoln Riley if he doesn't start turning these close losses into wins, if he doesn't start proving that he can take this team to be a competitive force in the Big Ten. I don't think anyone's looking at this coming season and saying USC has to win a national title. I think most of their fan base is realistic enough, but most USC fans want to at least feel like maybe USC could make the playoff by the end of the season. And if Lincoln Riley isn't providing that, then what is left of the fan base that hasn't already fully turned on him, and I will tell you, there are a lot of people who have fully turned on Lincoln Riley, but the holdouts will have turned completely. Does that result in Lincoln Riley's firing is a much more complicated question, because USC is not Texas A&M, and I cannot imagine USC paying a buyout as significant as Lincoln Riley's will still be at the end of next season. We're talking still upwards of $60 million, I would guess, and that's on the low end of what that buyout would be, depending on the details. Is USC the kind of school that pays a $60 million coaching buyout? Not in my lifetime. There is no oil baron who's going to come in and foot that bill. In one sense, yes, there is a lot of pressure on Lincoln Riley. In another sense, he's almost playing with house money, because I don't see how USC can actually fire him. And so much of what USC is doing now is so heavily predicated on the sixth class and this new recruiting philosophy and Chad Bowden sort of building a roster for him, that USC could very easily talk themselves into saying, well, we just need to take more things out of Lincoln Riley's hands, put more things in Chad Bowden's hands, and let him be the head coach, like an NFL-style head coach, where all he focuses on the football. And if all he does is focus on the football, then theoretically, we know he can win football games. He's done it too often in his career, too consistently in his career before USC, to say that he can. Like, forgotten some of those things. He still puts together, even as frustrating as USC's offense was this year, he still puts together an offense that is by and large competitive, and everyone still loves the defensive coordinator hire and so I just don't see USC blowing it up. I would almost guarantee that we will see Lincoln Riley in 2026, whether the fan base wants that or not. The question is, for me, going into 2026, what are the vibes going into 2026? Because I have now gone through enough coaching firings to know what an off season ahead of a coach firing looks like. And it was pretty toxic ahead of the 2013 season when Lane Kiffin got fired. It was toxic for 4 years of Clay Helton before he got hired, in terms of expectations going into the offseason. And as much as there are things that USC will want to control, the one thing that they can't necessarily control is like how empty the Coliseum is. And will you really sit there and let 2026 come around and, the attendance get down closer to 50,000? I think that would be a reality that you would have to face, winning back over the fan base if you don't do something about Lincoln Riley. I just don't think there is anything to be done at this point, realistically, short of a catastrophic USC starts the season with a relatively easy schedule. Like if USC goes, 1-4 and loses to Clay Helton's Georgia Southern, then yeah, maybe I will have changed my tune about how realistic it is to fire Lincoln Riley. But I think that he knows, and I know, and Jen Cohen, the athletic director, knows, and any USC fan who really takes a second to think about the realities of contracts and finance and all of these kinds of things knows that Lincoln Riley is going to be the head coach of USC in 2026.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome insights, and just a great in-depth look at USC football, a very intriguing program every year because of that brand power, because of the history, but I think a pivotal year regardless for this program in year 2 in the Big Ten, with the expectations, some momentum with the recruiting like we talked about, some of the new hires and the direction that this program is trying to take that next step. it's going to be an exciting year for this program to kind of see if they can start making that move back up to the top where they expect to be. But once again, guys, we've been excited to be joined by Alicia de Artola. She is an editor at FanSided. Check out her work there, as well as her podcast, Reign of Troy Radio. Very popular USC football podcast covering all things USC, of course, and you can find her work there. So thank you so much for being on the show. This has been an absolute blast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for putting up with my long-winded rambling, but I hope I gave a little bit of insight into the mind of a USC fan, which is a scary place right now.
Thanks for listening to the Pint Glass Football Podcast. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at PGF Podcast.